you know the #1 selling comic book of all time was Jim Lee's X-Men #1 from the 90s? It sold 8.1 million copies. But that almost didn't happen. We almost didn't get one of the greatest comic book artists of all time, Jim Lee, because of one small decision that he made. He was on his way to become a doctor, and he said, I don't want to become a doctor anymore. And his parents said, you better go to medical school. You're already in it and we're already paying for it, so you're going to finish. And he said, screw you, I'm not going. And then he made a deal with his parents that he would try for a whole year to break it into the comic book industry. And he practiced pretty much every day for about 8 to 10 hours a day, drawing. And he had 1 year and he actually did break into it. So I figured, let's go through some of Jim Lee's most iconic and classic covers he's ever done. So this is kind of like the history of Jim Lee through his comic book covers. So Jim Lee was already a pretty good artist, but he was trying to break into the comic scene, and it was very tough to do. But he did get a job doing the interiors and the inking for Solson's Christmas special. And that in a 9/8 is going to run you about $875. But that wasn't really breaking into the comic book scene. That was just a local comic shop that offered him a job. And time was running out, and he really needed to break into the industry because he didn't want to become a doctor. So he tried so many times sending his portfolio to all different publishers, and every single one said the same thing. No, go away, you're horrible, worst artist I've ever seen. By now he was ready to give up. His year was almost over. And his friend said, hey, come down to the New York Comic Con. There should be some Marvel people there that you can talk to. And basically with his last chance trying to do this whole comic book artist thing, I went to the Comic Con. And there he got in touch with one of Marvel's editors. And guess what? He liked his portfolio. He thought he was pretty good. And in fact, he liked him so much, he said, you know what? I have a job for you. And he gave him his first job at Marvel on Alpha Flight number 51. But before he did the interiors for Alpha Flight number, he did do a little bit of an ad for Alpha Flight in Marvel Age Annual number 3. A tiny little ad that he drew. And in a 9/8, that's going to run about $30. And that ad was for his first official work at Marvel, Alpha Flight number 51. And in a 9/8, that is going to run you about $81. Now, just 2 issues later, he got to do his very first cover in Alpha Flight number 53. And in fact, there's Wolverine on the cover. And this is going to run you about $150 in a 9.8. Now, he continued doing Alpha Flight more and more issues. And then he came in contact with Carl Plotz, who liked his art so much, he's like, hey, you know what a very popular character is right now? Actually, one of the most popular characters at Marvel right now during the 80s was actually Punisher. He was blowing up. Now, they had the Punisher series, but they were going to do a second series of Punisher. And this was going to be titled Punisher War Journal. And by issue number 1, he started, but he did the interior on number 1 only. And that is going to run you about $100. Then by issue 2, he took over and he was the cover artist from then on out. And at number 2, it's going to run you about $80 in a 9/8. So now he was juggling Alpha Flight and Punisher War Journal. And he decided to take on another Marvel project. He took on Conan. And he started on Conan by issue number 218. And that's going to run you about $100. And one of the best covers he did with Punisher War Journal was number 6 and 7, where he battles Wolverine. Number 6 is fantastic. I love this cover. And that's going to run you about $90. And then also he did number 7 as well, Punisher and Wolverine. And that's going to run you about $80. Now, he's mainly doing those 3 different comic lines. And he did jump over and do Transformers for a couple issues. He started with number 53. And in a 9.8, that is going to run you $380. Now, his plate was kind of full at this point, but they needed a fill-in at one of their comics, and they kind of liked his work that he's been doing on Wolverine when he guest starred in Punisher. And so they said, hey, Jim Lee, do you want to come over and maybe just do one comic? We just need one artist to do one comic over at Uncanny X-Men. So he did Uncanny X-Men 248. That was his first time doing X-Men. And in a 9.8, that is going to run you about $100. Now, pretty much after that, the rest is history, because once he started doing X-Men, people loved his X-Men. They loved it a ton. So a few issues later, he just continued doing it. And they just brought him on, and he kept on. And he just became the main artist on the X-Men run. But what he did early on is he really didn't like some of the characters' design, so he decided to do a redesign of Psylocke. And in X-Men 256, he did a redesign of Psylocke and made her into the Psylocke that we all love and enjoy now, and that's going to run you about $120 in a 9.8. And since people loved his X-Men so much, they're like, well, Wolverine's part of X-Men. Let's have Jim Lee draw some Wolverine covers, because Wolverine was probably their hottest star at the time. So he started on Wolverine number 24, and that's going to run you about $82. But his most iconic Wolverine pretty much ever done is Wolverine number 27, and that's going to run you about $200. It was so good that they even put it on the cover of the Nintendo game. They made a Wolverine Nintendo game, and they used that comic cover as the cover for the Nintendo cartridge. Then a really good cover he did for X-Men was X-Men 268, and that's going to run you $180. And it had Captain America in the X-Men comic book, and they loved it so much, they're like, hey, Jim Lee, why don't you come over and do a Captain America comics? So he did Captain America 383, and that's going to be about $100. So he's juggling a bunch of different comic series he had to do, and they were going to revamp the X-Men. So one of the last Conan issues that he did was Conan 242, and that's going to run you about $150. And now here comes Jim Lee's most classic cover that he's ever done. He wanted to revamp the characters much like he did with Psylocke. So he redesigned all the characters with X-Men number 1. And this went on to sell 8.1 million copies. Biggest selling comic of all time. Nothing's ever even come close. Now, a 9.9 of this did sell for $3,000 recently, yes. But if you wanted just a 9.8, it's going to run you about $70. Now, at this point, Jim Lee was a rock star in the comic book field. People loved his work, and he was making Marvel so much money. But there was something brewing within Marvel. You had other rock stars, such as Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, and a few others that were like, hey, we're bringing Marvel in millions of dollars, but we're not getting really any royalties, none of this. We're creating characters that go on to sell t-shirts and all sorts of stuff, but we're not getting any of that. And so they started to get resentful of Marvel, and they're like, fine, we're going to leave. We're going to create our own comic line. Now, Jim Lee, at first, he didn't want any part of that. He's like, look, I'm happy doing the covers. They make me a lot of money. I'm totally fine. I don't need to go off and make my own publisher. But finally, something broke Jim Lee. Jim Lee had to go do a comic book kind of like auction, art auction, and he wanted an extra ticket because Marvel's paying for him to go. He wanted Marvel to pay for an extra ticket for his wife so she could go as well. And they said, nah. And he's like, look, I've made you millions and you can't even spring like $100 for an extra ticket. He said, screw you, I'm leaving and I'm going with the others and we're going to start Image Comics. So one of the last comics he did was X-Men number 11 at Marvel. And people love this cover, and it's about $100. Now, if you got the second printed one, it's going to be about $1,000. So then in 1992, he started Image. Now, the way Image worked is each artist had their own publisher, and then Image would just distribute the comics. So he created Wildstorm, and his first comic he created was Wildcats. Now, that's going to run you about $80. Continued doing different Wildstorm productions and different covers and different comics. Actually, in the mid-90s, his Wildcats creation got picked up as a Saturday morning cartoon by CBS. And so he actually did a comic for them, Action Zone number 1, which actually featured the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's going to run you about $100 in a 9.8. And it's one of the only times that Jim Lee actually did the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. By the mid-90s, comic books have started to implode on themselves. They're selling a lot in the early 90s, but now not so much. And comic book stores are closing left and right. People weren't buying comics like they used to. And even Marvel's flagship character, the Fantastic Four, was waning. So they needed to revamp the Fantastic Four. So they called up Jim Lee and like, hey, look, we're going to redo Fantastic Four with number 1, and we need a big heavy hitter artist. Will you do it? So he said yes. So he revamped the Fantastic Four. And in 1996, Fantastic Four number 1 came out, and that's going to sell about $70 in a 9.8. All through the mid to late 90s, Jim Lee continued working at Wildstorm, his publication. But honestly, he was getting tired of it. He was tired of being basically a CEO and a manager and a business person. He just wanted to draw. That's all he really wanted to do. So he then sold Wildstorm to DC Comics. and just became an artist once again at DC Comics. And they brought him over to Batman, where he did Batman 608. This was the Hush storyline, and this one did phenomenal. Number 608, if you have the second printing, which is a very great cover, people love a Batman, it's going to be about $650. You can also get the retail incentive variant, which is going to be out $7,000 in a 9.8. He did a great cover with Superman in 612, that's $90, and then one with the Joker, and that's $75 in a 9.8. Now they loved what he did with Batman, so they brought him over to Superman, and he had a tiny run there. And one of the best covers he did then was Superman 204, and that's going to be about $150. So now he's just working at DC left and right, doing all sorts of stuff. He did a really cool cover, Infinite Crisis #1, which is going to be about $50. He did that in 2005. But as time went on, Jim Lee started moving up in the ranks at DC. He eventually became CEO, but in 2011, he had a great idea to revamp the entire DC lineup. And that would be the New 52 by DC. And that started in 2011 with Justice League #1, and that's going to run you about $75. He has since now become the head of DC Comics and still is today. He still draws comics, which he really loves to do. That's like his main passion. But to think that if Jim Lee would have just listened to his parents, he could have been a doctor, and maybe you would have went for him for whatever medical disease. He's probably going to be a proctologist. And so you go in there and he's like, "Hi, I'm Jim Lee." And you've never known that with those hands that were up your butthole would have been the hands that have drawn X-Men #1, the #1 selling comic of all time. Would have never been. Anyways, what is your favorite Jim Lee cover? And have a great day.